I'm Ronan Wordsworth.
And I'm Juan Francisco Muñoz, and this is the Geopolitical Pickle.
Disinformation is all around us. It's hard to go on social media these days without being inundated with people trying to manipulate our points of view using a variety of different tricks. That's why we thought it was essential to bring this series to air and explain the risks and the potential remedies against disinformation.
Disinformation Project is a 5-episode podcast where we will be exploring, with experts in the field, the effects of disinformation in the African continent, as well as its development and what are the tools used to spread this disinformation. Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoy the show. Hello, today we are joined by Will Brown, multi-awarded journalist and now Senior Policy Fellow at the Africa Program of the European Council of Foreign Relations and a Senior Associate of the Center for Strategic Studies in its Africa Program. How are you, Will?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me.
Well, Will has participated as a speaker in the seminar, A Surge of Disinformation Across Africa, hosted by the Masters in Geopolitics of Charles University in Prague with the sponsorship of NATO. We streamed it in our channel, so if you want to see the full seminar, check out our YouTube channel for recording. First of all, Will, how would you define disinformation?
Well, it's a massive question. I'm sure it's quite a controversial question for some people, but I would define it as a information campaign launched generally by a state, but also could be by a company to lie malignly and deceive people who consume that campaign. It maybe be easier for me to give you an example. If you go around the Sahel today, you might end up bumping into people who will tell you that NATO has been funding the jihadists in the Sahel, and this is why their armies, the Sahelian armies, have been struggling so much to defeat them. That is a classic example of a disinformation campaign.
Well, since you've talked about the Sahel, and I think it's an area which you've covered extensively, I think that's a good place to start. I think in this episode we want to dive into sort of the geopolitical situation there. So can you give us a bit of background about how the situation in the Sahel, so specifically, I mean, we've got the G5 coalition, etc., how that has evolved over the last few years, how it's become kind of this geopolitical hotspot, who are the players, the whole background to the situation?
Absolutely. I mean, it's like we could genuinely sit here for quite a while and talk about this, but if I'm just going to start off from the beginning, and I'm going to do a ride roughshod over some of the kind of events, but this will give listeners an idea, because while I think many people should pay more attention to West African politics and the intricacies of it than they do, the reality is many people don't. So let's start off. So it basically, in around the Sahel, we should start off by saying, is a kind of a largely strip of semi-arid land running right underneath the Sahara. Its technical way, it stretches all the way from Mauritania and Senegal all the way to the Horn of Africa, Sudan, Djibouti. Now this is a kind of this strip of land, just for kind of people's background, is the UN describes this area as ground zero for climate change. It is got some of the most rapidly growing populations in the world. So, for example, the average woman in Niger, one of the Sahelian countries, has 8 children on average per woman. And also currently is facing by far and away the largest jihadist insurgency on earth. We're talking about maybe 50 to 60% of certain countries which are now controlled by jihadist groups, but you don't really hear much about it on the news because it's often too complicated, or it's just put into, this is the Africa section, this has been going on for time immemorial, we don't care so much about it. So much more attention is given for other issues. So basically in 2012, there was a rebel movement which allied partly with a jihadist movement called Ansar Din. They armed themselves with many of the weapons which were from Colonel Gaddafi's weapons arsenals, and they kind of flooded out of the Sahara Desert where they've been moving around and took over basically the northern half of Mali. When it looked like, and at the same time the Malian government was in disarray, the Malian government began to collapse. And when it looked like that Sahelian, that kind of rebel force was going to advance on the southern capital in Mali, Bamako, Mali reached out to France, the former colonial power in the region, and they intervened in a highly effective operation with the support of special forces, kind of commandos from Chad, which is 2 countries along. This was a highly effective operation. It was called Operation Serval. And basically what the French and the Chadians managed to do, they succeeded in doing, was pushing the rebels and jihadists out of urban settlements and inflicting huge amount of damage. But what they couldn't do was they couldn't guarantee security in rural areas. And so Operation Serval, the French operation, morphed into Operation Barkhane. This eventually led to the creation of, there was a UN peacekeeping mission in Mali. There was a huge kind of pan-European effort, really, with everyone from the UK and to Estonia pitching in their effort to try and stabilize some of these governments across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. But basically, the distances between different areas, the vast expanse of it. To give people an idea, I think Mali is twice the size of France. It was just almost impossible. And so you basically have this insecurity which is spread out. Partly it's Al-Qaeda, an Al-Qaeda affiliated group called Nusrat al-Islam, and partly it's an Islamic State aligned group. This insecurity is spread out basically from the northern stretches of Mali into the center of Mali, across Burkina Faso, and into westerly Niger. And it's now spread to such a point where it's now touching upon the northern stretches of the Gulf of Guinea countries. And the Gulf of Guinea countries, when I talk about Gulf of Guinea, I mean Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, Togo, and to an extent Ghana, although Ghana is the only country in the Gulf of Guinea which has not yet seen a terrorist attack.
Yeah, then I think, obviously you mentioned there, these are a lot of Francophone countries. France has quite a close relationship, or did have quite a close relationship with especially these Sahelian countries. How has that changed, perhaps, over the last 5 years? We've seen, obviously, France have a significant amount of troops there, as well as economic ties through French interests and industry, as well as this political ties to a lot of the ruling class in these Sahelian countries prior to, say, 2020.
Well, it's shifted dramatically. And so a kind of common criticism you'll hear about the French is kind of wrapped up in this word, France-Afrique. And it's basically, France-Afrique is a term which is used in a kind of insulting, critical way to describe France's series of post-colonial relations with the former states of Francophone Africa, France's former colonies there. Now, these are basically, the term describes a series of intelligence, economic, political links, and a kind of an idea of a revolving door between the Élysée Palace in Paris and different kind of presidential houses across West Africa. No, so. And the kind of presiding criticism for many years has basically been, look, independence came in 1960, but the French never really left. And many Sahelians, many West Africans in former Francophone countries are justifiably quite miffed about this. Like, you know, if you ever travel to a country, for example, like Senegal, and you go outside the airport, you go and buy a SIM card. You get an Orange SIM card. You go on the motorway, it's been built by Eiffage. You go and drink the water in your hotel, it's run by Suez. You know, I can carry on like this. You know, the shipping companies are run by Bolloré, another French company. If you turn the TV, it's Orange again. So the French had a kind of a dominance in France had a dominance in the political and the economic spheres, which really you don't see across much of Eastern Africa, which were former British colonies. So what happened in the Sahel was you had 10 years of various Western, primarily European interventions across they were in humanitarianism, in development, military interventions, and these basically all fundamentally failed to address the security situation. Millions of people were displaced. Sahelian soldiers were basically kind of fed into this meat grinder. where they were ill-armed, they were ill-equipped, ill-trained to take on kind of highly motivated jihadist forces who are well-armed, with and making money hand over fist from gold mining. And this fed, understandably, quite a bit of anger, disillusionment with the Western military intervention among the Sahelian soldiers. And eventually, this sort of boiled over into these several different coups. Now, there's lots of kind of different debate to and fro on what kind of really instigated these coups. But broadly, it was a dissatisfaction with the French counter-terrorist operation and also with the American one. Now, the interesting thing comes in here, which is what I think some of us want to talk about a bit more, and it's the Russian disinformation angle. You can literally, if you're good with technology and good at mapping kind of different social media accounts, you can literally track Russian disinformation movements across the Sahel, and they match up quite clearly with each of the coups. So what happens is you have what Russia has managed to do is hijack, in a way, Pan-Africanist thinkers, many of whom express kind of justifiable anti-French, kind of anti-neocolonialism arguments. And the Russians have managed to hijack that and align themselves with the kind of, these old anti-colonial ideas.
Yes, and in a way,
old liberation ideas from the kind of the time of the USSR.
So, as you're mentioning, there are some reasons behind the initial outrage against the French in the region, but there's clearly been an increase of that dissatisfaction, or at least a guiding factor to that dissatisfaction. I, for example, used to follow and follow many accounts that have a critical vision of the West in Africa, both in Twitter, in any social media, to be fair. And I saw personally how the speech was changing from a genuine either Pan-Africanist or anti-French sentiment that there was in the beginning, anti-colonial and so on, to one that it was praising how Russia was doing it in neighboring countries. I remember, for example, a post of an Africa-based outlet, of how well were the Wagner troops working in Central African Republic to secure that their minings and so on. So how have these disinformation campaigns somehow shaped the already existing grievances that the population may have had with their idea?
I mean, yeah, it's quite an extraordinary transition. So, for example, there's one account I sometimes turn on, which is called something, I've forgotten exactly the title, but it's like called Benin Poulet, right? Poulet de Benin or something like this, chicken of Benin. And you can literally, it starts off with this quite nice, homely looking guy kind of describing, like working in a chicken pen, kind of telling people how much food to give them, all this kind of stuff. And it racked up a lot of followers. It racked up somewhere in the region of 100,000 followers on YouTube. And then you can literally see the moment the account switches, that someone has basically fed this guy something else, and you end up with this kind of very nicely packaged pro-Russian, pro-junta in the Sahelian propaganda. So you can literally track it to that point.
Can we trace how has it impacted people? And like if people were, for example, more prone to go demonstrating. I remember seeing a lot of demonstrations, which I wasn't there, so I don't know if the number was the number that I thought, or if it was exacerbated also by these social media outlets. These disinformation campaigns have actually shaped the mentality also of the people on the ground, or is it something that we are not perceiving properly?
I think it's always quite hard to measure how effective disinformation campaigns have been, but on an anecdotal level, I remember, for example, when I was working as a reporter, I was interviewing some Sahelian soldiers, and they said they would just parrot back to me many of the talking points, which are clearly had originated from pro-Russian social media campaigns. So, for example, the reason we're losing this war is because France is allowing. They're actually mining secretly some kind of mystery substance in the Sahara. Maybe it's uranium, maybe it's gold, and that's what's keeping them rich. And they're funding these jihadists so that we don't, so that we can't get to that territory and see what they're fighting, see what they're mining. So on an anecdotal, it has a tremendous impact. A friend of mine, a colleague, was just in Senegal, and he was chatting quite nicely just to a taxi driver. And then the taxi driver repeated verbatim back to him a disinformation campaign that my friend had just seen 2 weeks prior, which was something along the lines of France making the French army checking every single cargo container that came into Dakar port because it wanted to check for items which the Senegalese were not meant to have. It's this idea of sovereignty, and this is just kind of. This is on an anecdotal level. Lots of people have kind of stories like this who work on the region. Now, like there's a lot of kind of criticism sometimes of disinformation campaigns. They say, as in, people say, really, can you just say that this was actually that effective? Was Trump really elected with the help of Russian disinformation? Isn't this all a bit overblown? And I think that actually, this stuff, this kind of, it's not particularly advanced, much of this Russian disinformation we see. It's quite basic stuff, really. And if you have the technical know-how, you can track it and see it, and you can debunk it quite easily. But it is the volumes which are coming out now, the way it's being sprayed, just kind of anti-Western narratives, conspiracy theories, it's quite extraordinary. And you have to remember that this is happening in a region where illiteracy is really high, with maybe 70% in some of these countries, and it's not like this is happening in an advanced democracy in South Korea or in the UK or America. It's happening in countries where people often haven't been given the right lessons to be able to interrogate some of this stuff.
And if it happens already in our countries that we're having this disinformation campaigns and it's affecting, we can trace it back, for example, in cases like Brexit or in cases like the United States, these campaigns have been proven to be happening. So obviously, yeah.
And when, as you say, anecdotally, we can see that it's definitely, there's some level of breakthrough on the ground there. And then we see in pictures that come out from admittedly junta-run media channels, however, there's Russian flags being waved in the streets. There's people like very much supportive of the military regime when the facts on the ground, I think, would not bear out any real reason to be super supportive of them. If we look at the security situation from when they came into power, for the stated reason of restoring security, to now, where the security situation is even worse than before.
So just a small point on the flags thing. I think most people who maybe be listening to this might have seen kind of protesters waving Russian flags or anything. But if you actually think about that, I mean, it's probably like one of the most low-cost and hyper-effective disinformation campaigns you could imagine running. You come into, I don't know, into a particular country, let's just say like Burkina Faso for sake of argument, you bring with you about like 1,000 Russian flags, kind of all packaged up in different suitcases, and you basically just hand it out to random people on the street. A lot of people don't have much money, don't have a job, and you just hand them a bit of money and you say, we want you to go and wave this flag. And then you let the Western media do the rest. And the Western media will disseminate those images around not just Africa, but the world, and give the impression of Russia as this kind of almighty force where kind of even random people on the street in Burkina Faso are waving the flag. That's not to say there aren't genuine supporters of Russia, but it's quite a messy hodgepodge of things. And so, yeah.
Yeah, low cost, high impact sort of, I mean, that's not just even with the flag, but the same thing could be said with the social media angle for disinformation. It's like overall a very low cost way of changing the narrative. However, you get a high impact out of it because you're able to directly impact people's perceived reality there. And as you said, there's not this history of necessarily critical media literacy and looking at sources, having these different perspectives. So you get saturated by one narrative that is very easy, I think, to change people's mind. And we see that, as you said, in the Western world as well. We see it, especially people get sucked into sort of bubbles on Twitter, on Facebook, and you get stuck in these groups which target you into a specific way. So I think we see the same thing playing out here, but it's even maybe hyper-focused in these other environments.
Absolutely. And you have to, like, I have several friends, Sahelian journalists, who, one or two of them have been approached by kind of Russian media and offered pretty lucrative, by comparison of local standards, deals to kind of write things which are favourable to a particular disposition. So it's also easier to buy journalism, and you see that, and it's sadly the case. But you see that sometimes with the way that China engages in Africa, how it engages with just paid editorials and things like this. And the thing is, these are things which the West are just not willing to countenance or do, and justifiably so, because it's really grim stuff. But because we're not doing it, the other actors basically have a free card to kind of spray whatever they want out.
You're not playing on the same even playing field.
Yeah,
right?
we're not at all, and I don't think we should be. But it does leave us in a bit of a kind of policy conundrum. How do you address this? How do you fight back?
Yeah, and actually, it's a really good question. I want to ask you a little bit, because your focus has not just been it's Africa, but your focus, I've seen your writings from the Sahel, but also from East Africa, the area of the Horn, and so on. When we talked to some of the other interviewers, they mentioned that obviously Africa is a continent. There's many different cultures, many different approaches, many different media landscapes too. In the Horn of Africa, have you been reporting? Can you say something about disinformation campaigns happening there? Are they happening from the same actors? Are they not? I don't know if there's.
When I was a reporter, I worked a lot on the kind of the Ethiopian civil war, or the Tigray war. It's kind of, the war is basically, and it's over now partly, but it's basically dropped out of the people's consciousness. That basically for this was the most appalling conflict probably in the, I would argue, in the modern era. I mean, we're talking about maybe 600,000 people being killed in northern Ethiopia. We're talking about just war crimes on an extraordinary scale, kind of man-made famine, rape used as a weapon of war, just the most atrocious things possible. And what happened is this war was fought mainly behind a media blackout. Basically, the government in Addis Ababa, when they invaded the northern region of Tigray, they'd learned the lessons of the Arab Spring. They'd seen how powerful social media could be as a way of rallying kind of support, international support, and they basically shut off everything. They shut off the communication systems, and it became incredibly difficult for reporters to get, getting inside for a long time was just not even on the cards because the access was denied, but just to get reliable information out of there. And I would argue that is one of the first times we really saw kind of industrialized disinformation campaigns coming out against the reporters, brilliant Ethiopian journalists who were working incredibly hard to dig up evidence of war crimes committed by both sides. I can't tell you where those disinformation campaigns came from. Was it by outside actors who supported the Ethiopian government in Addis or supported the Eritrean government in Asmara? I can't say that. Was it a local campaign? But they were there for sure. And anyone who reported on that conflict will and waded through that kind of cesspit on Twitter and different social media outlets will know what I'm talking about.
I think we actually spoke to Voice of America journalist about the Eritrean and Ethiopian situation, just from perspective of fact checking and the moderation on social media, because there's so these global different dialects in Ethiopia, and all the hate speech and the targeted attacks on local journalists was basically unmoderated because Facebook and Twitter had no money to do the moderation for these countries at all. So again, it went unchecked, and just, as you said, was able to propagate on a massive scale. And I think, I wonder, what do you think now? We see, obviously, the conflict is still simmering now. Well, it's not at the same intensity as it was a few years ago, but it certainly hasn't. The situation hasn't been resolved. But even on the border, and in the two neighboring countries of Ethiopia, we've got Sudan and we've got Somalia, where there's two ongoing issues domestically. We've got the civil war in Sudan, and we've got Somalia basically losing significant ground to al-Shabaab, and then Ethiopia being involved in that. And I think, have you seen like these lessons be spread so that what the Ethiopian government used, well, not the Ethiopian government, but what was used in Ethiopia against journalists, has that sort of propagated around neighboring countries, these lessons about how to suppress dissenting voices, whether that's then investigation of war crimes or even critical voices or things like this?
I think these lessons haven't just propagated around the Horn of Africa. I think they've been learned by a lot of autocracies around the world. I think those lessons have spread. And I think, look, you just mentioned a really kind of important point. I mean, what is going on right now in the Horn of Africa is just, it beggars belief. It's so unbelievably complicated, and there is so many awful conflicts going on. I mean, Sudan, you mentioned, Sudan, by kind of different experts, they say that it's the biggest humanitarian catastrophe in the world today. It's worse even than Gaza and Ukraine combined. That's just the scale of the devastation going on. I think kind of maybe a low estimate of 150,000 dead now. After 2 years, a year and a half, and I think I've forgotten the latest figure, but I was in closed room kind of discussions with different kind of diplomats and specialists on this, and they were talking about something like 2,000 or 3,000 people dying a day of famine. It's on another kind of scale, and it's very sadly it gets almost no media attention whatsoever.
Then, well, I think we've talked a little bit about both areas, so I think it's about time to end our conversation. And in this sense here, as we started asking you what do you think about disinformation, how do you think we can tackle disinformation from your experience or from your thoughts?
It's a really good question, and I don't think there's any easy answer. Basically, I think Europeans haven't just cottoned on to the fact of how bad the information space is for them in sub-Saharan Africa. If you go and talk to different European diplomats who are actually working in these countries, they will tell you this is absolutely awful. It's to the extent where you might turn up your diplomat might turn up at a meeting and with a powerful official, and the official will be convinced of some kind of thing which is quite clearly a product of a Russian disinformation campaign, a WhatsApp group, a Signal group, or something like this, where they've been sent something. It is fundamentally altering how the West is perceived, how Europeans are perceived. And they, when they kind of, some of these European diplomats, they try and take that message back to Brussels, the message will get lost in the maze, which is Brussels. It will just kind of, nothing really actually happens. We talk about actually addressing disinformation, but we're not kind of addressing it anywhere near the scale we meant to. I think kind of there's some interesting campaigns going on, and the European Union were very good at debunking stuff, right? But if you actually think about debunking, and is that actually the most effective way of fighting of fighting it? I mean, yeah, it's part of the way, but I mean, by the time that you've debunked it, there's about 100 other bits of fake information already out there. I think what Europeans should be concentrating on and should really invest time, resources, coordinate between different member states on is taking the fight a little bit back, pushing back the narrative. You know, I don't want to see sort of like, look at this, how glorious the EU is and our values and all this stuff. It's completely irrelevant. It's stupid. It's banal. I get bored by it. I'm fairly sure, like someone average American probably thinks it's pretty stupid. What I think we need to be doing is encouraging critical thought, disseminating information we have, intelligence we have, which is showing what hostile actors are doing in Africa, right? They're not these kind of saviors coming in who are, the champions of the third world. No, they're not. They are murdering people. They're looting these countries. They are, in the case of China, they are pillaging the waters around the West African fishing waters. They are corrupting politicians often. I think we need to be kind of shifting the narrative back onto that and just exposing some of this stuff.
Well, I think that's a good place to leave it for today. I think I agree wholeheartedly. I think by trying to combat, by just fact-checking, you've got two problems. First of all, as you said, you're basically doing a drop in the ocean compared to how much gets propagated. But second, a lot of the time, the horse is already bolted. You're trying to chase after this story when the people see their disinformation. They don't see the correction or the fact-checking, and there's not like that memory of that piece of disinformation because it's run so far away. But I think there is strategies which, as you say, can be employed.
Yeah, so look, Europe is never going to invest in kind of bot systems in the same way that Russia, Turkey, UAE, a whole host of other middle powers have done. Europe is never going to do that. That's not what we are. We've kind of learned the lessons of propaganda in the past. In the 20th century, this is not what we're going to do. What we can do is identify potential opinion leaders in these countries and kind of reach out to them and give them evidence of what the Russians are doing. What are the Africa Corps doing? What are the...
I mean, because if people see the reality, their mind will be changed pretty quickly when you see actually, as you say, the Africa Corps or the old Wagner Group are pillaging. They're making billions of dollars worth of gold every year from some of these Sahelian countries just by controlling the narrative. And they've pretended the security situation has gotten better, where maybe the military regime in the capital is protected. But as soon as you step outside the capital, even in the capital, we saw recently in Bamako, but as soon as you step foot outside the capital, in rural areas of the country, there's no security whatsoever. There's a breakdown of state completely. And
absolutely, and I think this is one of the strange things about Russia and its involvement in West Africa is we tend to think that in the West, I speaking as a former journalist, we tend to over-egg Russia in Africa. I think I was talking to a friend of mine recently who had been a journalist in Pakistan, and there was a period he was saying where everyone was just kind of freaking out about Chinese. All the Western diplomats were just freaking out about how amazing China was, how they were just 5 steps ahead of Europe at every single turn. But in reality, there was just a ton of kind of semi-balding Chinese diplomats running around pulling their hair out because of how complicated it was and how well they were being played by. And I think this is kind of, you can take this analogy and put it on kind of what Russia is doing now in parts of Africa. Basically, we tend to think that they're 3 steps ahead of us every stage, and they are these kind of masters. It almost kind of fits into the stereotypes you see in movies, like the Bond villain just kind of outwitting Bond at every single occasion. It kind of fits into the way we kind of understand and see the world. And in reality, that if you actually look at what the Russians managed to do, yes, at the beginning, when Russia kind of sent its forces into Mali, when it kind of moved into Burkina Faso, when it's kind of done a certain level of engagement with Niger, it certainly seemed like the Russians were kind of incredibly strategic. They had moved in perfectly, they timed it perfectly, and they coordinated it excellently. But now, if you look at it, kind of the situation 2 years on, Russia's been in Mali for some time now. What have they actually done? They've basically they've propped up a bunch of thugs in the capital, and the security situation is worse than ever. The same for Burkina Faso. I think it's quite painfully apparent to many Sahelian officials that no matter how much kind of disinformation and propaganda which is pumped out, it's quite obvious that Russia does not have the financial heft, it does not have the political tools necessary to be able to do anything. What they can provide is shoddy weapons, a couple of mercenaries to protect the supreme junta leader, and then and some disinformation campaigns and some exploitative mining deals. That's not what is going to solve the crisis, Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, and thanks very much, and thank you guys, thank you everyone for listening, and join us next time on the Geopolitical Pickle.
Great name.